Soon another troublesome thing happened. Li Ping suddenly began acting crazy. Every time they stopped somewhere, she would periodically begin shouting and screaming nonsense. Sometimes, she would even start to tear and rip at her clothes and make all kinds of weird faces and gestures. At first, Duan Tiandi thought that she really had gone crazy, but after a few days he suddenly figured it out. As it turned out, she was afraid that her pursuers had lost them and was purposefully leaving a trail for them to follow. This was what was making it even harder for him to lose them. By now the end of summer had passed and the cool breezes began to blow. In order to avoid capture, Duan Tiandi went well up into the North Country. The money he had taken with him was about to run out, yet the freaks were still close on his trail. Back in Hangzhou, I was important, I was somebody. Meat, wine, money, women, I had it all. But I had to get greedy and go to Ox Village and kill this bitch's hubby and get myself into this mess. He cursed himself. Several times, he was on the verge of leaving Li Ping and running off by himself. But each time, he could not summon up enough courage to do it. Every attempt to kill her ended in failure as well. What was supposed to be protection had somehow turned into a curse that he just could not get rid of. On top of everything else, he had to be constantly on guard against her attempts to avenge her husband. He was frustrated, frightened, and angry. Yet there was nothing he could do. Before he realized it, he had arrived at the capital of the Jin Empire, Yanjing. Duan Tiandi thought for a bit and decided to try and find an out-of-the-way place and finish off Li Ping. In such a huge and bustling city, there was no way those who were chasing him could find him. Happy that things were finally going to work out, he made his way towards the city. Unexpectedly, just as he arrived in the front of the gate to the city, a team of Jin soldiers came walking out from inside. Not even bothering to ask any questions, they seized both him and Li Ping, handed them each a carrying stick, and commanded them to carry cargo for them. Because Li Ping was short and a woman, her load was reasonably light. But Duan Tiandi was given 250 kilograms 110 pounds loads and they were practically forcing him to his knees. This group of soldiers followed an official as they headed north. As it turned out, that particular official was an emissary who was being sent out to present royal warrants from the Jin Emperor to the Mongolian subjects of the Jin Empire. The Jin soldiers that accompanied him were seizing any random Han Chinese that they ran into, forcing them to carry their heavy cargo and food supplies so as to save themselves from the labor. Duan Tiandi argued back a couple of times and was immediately answered by several stinging lashes to his head. This situation he had seen many times before, so it was all quite familiar to him. But before, he had been the one that was doing the whipping, not receiving it. By now, Li Ping's belly was huge and doing all this heavy work was on the verge of killing her. However, so determined was she to get revenge that she tried her best not to let the Jin soldiers find out about her condition. Fortunately, she had been working on a farm ever since she was able to walk, and this made her strong and used to this kind of grinding work. Having basically resigned herself to death, she was barely able to manage the dozen days they spent walking through the freezing and miserable steppe. Even though it was only October, being as far north as they were, a blizzard hit one day that not only brought snow, but also a sandstorm. Having nowhere to hide from the sand and the snow, the entire group, all 300 or so of them, lined up single file and continued to make their way through the endless grasslands of the steppe. Suddenly, faint shouting could be heard approaching from the north. Through the sun-filled air, an army of countless horsemen came charging at them. Before any of them realized what was going on, the army had arrived. As it turned out, they were an army from some unknown tribe from the north that had just lost a battle. Chaos descended on the group as everyone tossed their weapons away and began running for their lives. Some of those who did not have horses were quickly trampled by those who had. The Jin soldiers, seeing that defeat was inevitable, immediately scattered. Li Ping was originally at Duan Tiandi's side, but lost him during the chaos of the attack. She threw off her share of the cargo and ran as fast as she could in the direction where there seemed to be the least number of people. Luckily, everyone was so concerned with their own survival that nobody harmed her. After some running, her stomach began hurting intensely. Not able to go any further because of the pain, she lay down behind a sand dune and fainted. After what seemed like forever, she began to slowly come around. In the back of her mind, there seemed to be the crying noises of a baby. Not completely coherent, she still wasn't quite sure whether or not she was dead or alive. But the crying gradually got louder. She twitched and suddenly realized that there seemed to be a warm object between her legs. By now it was after midnight, the snow had just stopped and the moon had finally appeared from behind the parting clouds. She snapped wide awake and began to cry. In this impossible situation, the baby in her womb was born. She immediately sat up and took the baby in her hands. It was a boy. Overjoyed and crying, she used her teeth to bite off the umbilical cord and hugged the baby as tightly as she could. In the moonlight, she saw that the infant's eyes were huge and bright and looked very much like her deceased husband, and his crying was incredibly loud. Under normal circumstances, there should have been no way that she was going to survive after giving birth in such harsh conditions. But upon seeing her child, she suddenly found the strength that she didn't know she had, and she slowly got up on her knees and with one hand, crawled into a small ditch close by to escape from the cold. Looking at the baby and thinking of her husband, bittersweet memories and emotions overwhelmed her. The two of them spent the night in that ditch. The next morning, hearing nothing around her, she summoned up enough courage to climb out of it. Amongst the white snow and yellow sands, the ground was covered with discarded weapons and corpses. Nobody alive was to be seen. She scrounged some preserved food from one of the dead soldiers as well as a fire-making stone and knives. After carving some horse meat and cooking it, she searched around for some thicker clothing. She wrapped some around her baby and put some on herself as well. Luckily, the weather was so cold around this time of the year that nothing rots, so the horse meat was able to last her for a good few days, during which she was able to recover her strength. Then, carrying her baby, she began walking confidently towards the east. Even though she had lost the hated Duan Jiandi, all the hatred in her heart submerged and turned into love and tenderness. All she wanted was to protect her baby's face from the harsh steppe winds. After several more days, she noticed that the plant life around her was getting denser. This particular dusk, she suddenly spotted two horses galloping towards her. The riders noticed her and stopped to ask her what happened. Making wild gestures with her arms, she described her experience of meeting the defeated army and giving birth in the snow. These two riders were Mongolians. Even though they couldn't understand her at all, they, being the friendly and hospitable kind of people Mongolians are, felt sorry for her and invited her to spend the night with them in their Mongolian jir. Mongolians are a nomadic group of people, migrating along with their herds in the seasons. They live in huge shelters called gurs that are easily put up and taken down. The next morning this particular group of nomads departed, but they decided to leave her 4 small sheep to help her survive. After much suffering and labor, Li Ping settled down on the steppe. She erected a little hut using tree branches and reeds and obtained food through barter using the sweaters she knitted from the wool of the sheep. Time flew, and the little boy was soon 6 years old. Following the wishes of her former husband, Li Ping gave him the name of Gojing. The boy was rather slow and only began to speak at the age of 4. Luckily, he was a very strong boy and was able to herd the animals by himself. The two of them, mother and son, relied on each other, surviving on only the barest of essentials and leading a very simple and happy life. Both of them had learned Mongolian, and only when they were alone with each other did they speak in the Lin dialect of Chinese. Seeing the manly face on her son and hearing him speaking everything in the Lin dialect of her home frequently made her feel a bittersweet sadness. Your father was a man among men in Shandong. You should, by all means, speak the Shandong dialect as well. But we weren't together a long enough time and I couldn't learn it from him, so I can't teach you." It was October and the weather was slowly becoming colder and colder. Go Jing climbed onto his own little pony and set out, with a shepherd dog, to herd the sheep. Around noon, a huge black eagle suddenly appeared in the sky and dove down towards the herd. A particular young sheep was frightened and began to run for its life towards the east. Go Jing shouted several times at it to make the sheep stop, but it just kept on going. Go Jing immediately climbed onto his pony and went chasing after it. After 4 or 5 li or so, he finally caught up to the little sheep. Just as he was about to head back, he suddenly heard a very loud and constant rumble. Startled, he could not figure out what the rumble was, even though he suspected that it might be thunder. The rumble got louder and louder until, after a while, he was able to detect the sounds of horses neighing and humans screaming in the rumbling. Having never heard such things before, he was frightened and hurriedly led his little pony and the sheep into a clump of bush on top of a nearby hilltop. Only then did he dare to stick his head out to see what was going on. What he saw was dust covering the sky as countless numbers of chariots rushed about. Several leaders were shouting out commands as the armies were lining up. One was to the east while another one was to the west, and both contained more people than Go Jing thought there were in the whole world. Everyone was wearing a white-colored bandana on their heads. Some even stuck colorful feathers in them. By now Go Jing wasn't frightened anymore. He was too curious and excited. After another pause, from the left there suddenly came to the sounds of horns and several rows of soldiers charged. They were led by a tall and thin-looking young man wearing a blood-red cape. He was holding his saber above his head, ready to strike at anyone he happened upon. The two armies clashed and gruesome fighting ensued. The attacking side was outnumbered and was slowly being overwhelmed and began to retreat. But reserves soon came in support and the fighting escalated to a deafening level once again. It looked as if the attacking armies were about to collapse once again when the 10 horns that had signaled the start of the battle suddenly came to life again, making the noise level even more deafening than it had been. The attacking soldiers shouted, "Temujin is here! The great Khan Temujin is here!" Even though the two armies were still fighting relentlessly, everyone's head periodically turned toward the east, where the horns were located. Following their gaze, Go Jing looked toward the east as well. Through all the sand and dust that was filling the sky, he saw a group of riders galloping forth. Within the group, there was a huge pole, on which there were several white feathers. The cheering got louder as the riders got closer and the attackers seemed to fight more and more fiercely. The formations of the defending army were torn apart instantly. The huge pole slowly moved toward the very hill that Go Jing was hiding on. He retreated even deeper into the bush, but was still peeking out with his huge, bright pair of eyes. He noticed a very big and tall middle-aged man in the midst of the riders who ridden onto the hill. He was wearing an iron helmet on his head and had a brown tuft of beard on his chin. His eyes were beaming with energy and force. What Go Jing didn't know was that he was the leader of the Mongolian tribe, Temujin. But even if he did know, he wouldn't have known what a Khan was. On his horse, Temujin, accompanied by several riders, calmly surveyed the battle that was occurring at the foot of the hill. After a while, the young man with the red cape rode up the hill. "Father, there are too many of them, should we retreat a bit?" he shouted once he made it up the hill. By now Temujin had already finished surveying the battlefield. In a low voice, he commanded, "Take your team and fall back to the east. Mukali, go with the second prince and fall back to the west. Bagurchi, you and Chalan retreat to the north. Kublai, you and Sabade take your army and head south." Temujin continued, never taking his eyes off the battlefield. "When you see my banner raised up high, that's my signal. Immediately sound the horns, turn around and counterattack." All the officers rode off with their orders. Within seconds, the Mongol troops began retreating on all fronts. The enemy soldiers let out a great collective howl and, upon seeing Temujin's white feathered banner being raised high on the top of the hill, shouted in unison, "Capture Temujin! Capture Temujin!" Like ants, the opposing army began charging up the hill, completely ignoring the retreating Mongol troops. Horses and men charged with abandon. A yellow fog surrounded the hill from the dust they kicked up. Temujin stood at the top of the hill, not moving and resolute. A score of foot soldiers held up their shields and was protecting him from arrows flying from all directions. Temujin's sworn brother Katuku and standout General Jelm, along with 3,000 elite troops, were defending the base of the hill with everything they could muster, determined to the last man. Amid the flashing of blades and spears, the cries of battle were shaking the earth. Witnessing this, Gojing was at the same time excited and scared. After an hour or so of intense fighting, and under the relentless charges of tens of thousands of enemy troops, Temujin's elite guard of 3,000 had suffered about 400 casualties while cutting down more than 10,000 enemies. Looking out, Temujin saw that even though the battlefield was covered with enemy bodies and riderless horses running aimlessly, the number of enemy arrows flying in was still intense. On the northeastern end of the battle, the enemy attack was especially fierce, and the defense looked closer and closer to collapse. "Father, Ogdai," Temujin's third son, anxiously asked, "is it time to raise the banner? Their troops aren't tired yet." Temujin answered gravely, not moving his eyes away from the battle, even for a moment. By now there were 3 black banners at the northeast end of the battle, indicating that the enemy had gathered 3 standout generals there to command the troops. The Mongol defenders were steadily dropping back. Up the hill came Jelm, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Khan, we can't hold them any longer." "Can't hold them?" Temujin angrily shouted back. "What kind of man are you?" Jelm's expression changed and he grabbed a saber from one of the foot soldiers. With a shout, he charged into the enemy formation. Fighting with utter abandon, he carved a path of blood to the black banners. The enemy commanders, seeing his ferocity, immediately pulled hard on their reins and backed away. Jelm, with 3 swings of his saber, cut down the 3 men that were carrying the banners. Throwing down his saber, he wrapped his arms around the 3 banners, took them back to the top of the hill, and stuck them into the ground upside down. Seeing this incredible display, the enemy's morale was rocked. The Mongol troops responded with fury and the hole in the defense on the northeast end was quickly plugged. After more fighting, an enemy general with a black cape suddenly appeared in the southwest corner. Not wasting a shot, he quickly took down a dozen or so Mongol soldiers with his bow and arrows. 2 Mongol officers turned and charged at him with their spears. Using only 2 arrows, he easily shot the 2 officers off their horses. Such amazing skill! Even Temujin had to praise him after seeing that. By now, the general with the black cape had fought to near the foot of the hill. With the faint twang of a released bow, an arrow hit Temujin in his neck. Another arrow quickly followed, heading straight for Temujin's stomach. Realizing that he had been hit and another arrow was coming, Temujin immediately pulled hard on his reins, making his horse rear up on its hind legs. The arrow buried itself into the horse's chest all the way to the feathers, knocking the horse to the ground. Seeing the leader hit and falling, the Mongol troops were shocked. Screaming at the top of their lungs, and pouncing on the opportunity, the enemy charged forward like floodwater. Ogdai had just finished helping his father pull out the arrow in his neck and was tearing off his shirt to bandage up the wound when Temujin shouted, "Forget about me, defend the hill." Nodding quickly, Ogdai turned and immediately shot down 2 enemy officers. Katuku was commanding his troops guarding the west side of the hill, but, because they had run out of arrows and spears, he had to retreat. Jelm's eyes turned red as he saw him. "Katuku, are you going to run like a scared rabbit?" "Who's running?" Katuku smiled back, "I ran out of arrows." Temujin, still lying on the ground, took a handful of arrows and tossed them over to him. Katuku quickly put an arrow onto his bow and shot the closest black banner general off his horse. Quickly charging downhill, Kotuka grabbed that general's horse and returned. "Brother, you are really something," Temujin praised. Covered with blood from head to toe, Kotuka quietly asked, "Can we raise the banner and sound the horns?" "The enemy still isn't tired yet, just a bit longer," Temujin said, blood streaming down his palm that was pressing hard on the wound in his neck, trying to stop the bleeding. Upon hearing that, Kotuka dropped to one knee and begged, "We owe our lives to you and have no reservations about dying here. But Khan, please, you have to take care of yourself." Temujin shakily stood up, took the reins of the horse from Kotuka, and struggled mightily before finally mounting the horse. Waving his saber and shouting, "Hold the hill!" At the top of his lungs, he cut down 3 enemy soldiers that had charged up the hill. Seeing Temujin reappear, the opposing army's morale was shaken once again and the momentum shifted and they began to fall back down the hill. "Raise the banners! Sound the horns!" Temujin commanded, seizing on the fact that their enemy's morale was at a low. The Mongol army let out a collective howl as an officer climbed onto a horse, stood up, and raised the white feathered banner up as high as he could. The horns from all corners sounded. Immediately, the screaming of men drowned out the horns as row after row of Mongolian soldiers suddenly appeared from far away and approached with lightning speed. The enemy outnumbered the Mongols, but they were gathered around the hill. As soon as the soldiers on the outer edge began to fall back, the middle of their formation became chaotic. The general in black, noticing that the tide was turning, immediately began giving orders in hopes of rallying his troops. But the formation had already collapsed and the soldiers had no desire to fight any longer. Within an hour, the army had been smashed into pieces. Those who weren't killed were running for their lives. The general in black, riding his black horse, turned and joined them. 50 tals of gold for the man that catches that scoundrel," Temujin shouted. This immediately sent several scores of Mongolian elites after him. The general in black, not missing a shot, turned and shot down about a dozen or so pursuers one after the other. The rest of the pursuers did not dare get too close and, in the end, let him get away. Seeing all this from inside the bushes, Gojing was in awe of that general's bravery and skill. The battle was a complete victory for Temujin, destroying more than half of his nemesis, the Tatars' army. Surveying the battlefield, Temujin's memories of his past flashed before his eyes again, the poisoning of his father, being captured by the Tajuts, and all the torture and shame he went through at their hands. Although his mental wounds were still not healed, his joyful heart was filled with the sweet taste of revenge. Unable to hold it in any longer, he leaned back and laughed in triumph. Every soldier joined in with cheers, which shook the earth as they began to organize into formations and leave the battlefield. Gojing waited until even the Gravadigers had left due to darkness before he came crawling out of the bush. It was midnight when he got home and his mother, who was on the verge of a nervous breakdown waiting for him to come back, was overjoyed to see him. Gojing described what had happened to his mom, as best as he could. Li Ping, seeing his face alight with joy and amazement and without a trace of fear, thought to herself, that even though he was just a kid and a bit dumb, he was still very much like his father in this respect. Bittersweet feelings filled her heart. 2 mornings later, Li Ping went off to the marketplace 30 li away with 2 handmade wool blankets. Gojing was guarding the sheep out in front of his house when his mind wandered back to what he had seen 2 days ago. Deciding to have a little fun, he raised his shepherding whip and began waving it around. Riding on his little horse, shouting at the top of his lungs, and moving the flock around, he felt just like a general commanding his own troops into battle. Just as he was really getting into it, he suddenly heard the sound of horse hooves from the east. A solitary horse slowly approached with a person lying on its back. The horse got close and stopped, causing the man on the back of the horse to lift his head and look up. The sight of the man made Gojing shriek in fear. The man's face was covered with mud, dirt, and blood. It was the general in black that he had seen the day before yesterday. In his left hand was the bottom half of what had been a saber, which was stained purplish red with blood. The bow and arrows that he had fought so many foes with were gone. It looked as if he had another encounter with his enemies after escaping 2 days ago. His left cheek had been slashed open and was bleeding profusely. His horse was injured as well. His body shuddered as his bloodshot eyes fell upon Gojing, muttering in a hoarse and exhausted voice. "Water, water, some water?" Gojing immediately ran into the house and brought out a bowl of water from the water tub. That man grabbed it out of Gojing's hand and drank it all in one gulp. "More," he demanded. Gojing retrieved another bowl for him. He drank half before the blood dripping off of his face turned the water red. The man let out a loud laugh, then suddenly, his face twitched and he fell off his horse and fainted. Gojing panicked. He didn't know what to do. Luckily, the man came to after a while. "Give my horse some water too," he said, "and do you have anything to eat?" Gojing brought out some roasted lamb for him and got a whole bucket of water for the horse. After gulping down the hearty meal, the man was thoroughly refreshed and got up off the ground. "Thanks, brother," he said as he took off the gold bracelet he had around his wrist and held it out at Gojing. "Here, take it." Gojing shook his head. "Mom said that we should take care of guests and not ask for or take anything in return." The man laughed at this and commented, "You are a good kid." He put the bracelet back on his wrist, tore off half of his sleeve, and began to attend to both his and his horse's wounds. Suddenly, from the east came the faint rumblings of horses galloping. The man's face dropped. "Huh? Looks like they are not going to let me go." The two of them ran out of the door and saw that the land in the distance was covered by dust kicked up by countless horses heading this way. "Kid, do you have a bow and arrows in the house?" the man asked. "Yeah, sure," Gojing replied just before darting back into the house. Hearing that, the man looked somewhat relieved, but that soon changed when he saw that Gojing had just brought out his own little toy bow and arrow. He let out a little laugh before frowning. "I need the fighting kind, the big one." Gojing merely shook his head. The pursuers were getting closer, their banners could be faintly seen waving in the distance. The man figured that, with his horse injured, he wouldn't be able to get away. While hiding is always dangerous, he had no alternative. "I can't beat them all by myself, so I've got to hide," he said, turning to Gojing. He looked around and noticed that there was nowhere to hide in or around the hut. In desperation, he settled on the big pile of grass outside. "I'm going to hide in there. Could you chase my horse as far away as you can? Be sure to find a good place to hide for yourself too and don't let them catch you," he instructed as he dug himself into the grass pile. Traditionally, as soon as the scorching summer has passed, Mongolians would immediately cut down all the available tall grass and pile it up. During the harsh winters, Mongolians relied on these grass piles for feed for the animals as well as fire for warmth. Often these grass piles would be bigger than their gurs. The man was actually very well hidden inside the grass pile and probably wouldn't be discovered without careful inspection.